Thanks, Matt, for that introduction and welcome. It's great to be here. Vanessa would have loved to have joined me this morning, but she has responsibilities at Maryborough Corps as the Corps officer there. And in fact, she's conducting a dedication this morning from a child. In fact, it's a little bit confronting dedication because it's actually the grandchild of one of our junior soldiers when we were at Horsham Corps. How did that happen? I'm still coming to grips that we're grandparents, and here she is conducting a dedication of a grandchild of a junior soldier. My goodness, the years have gone fast. So it's my delight to represent both Vanessa and myself in sharing this presentation, but also to represent and be ambassadors for the Solomon Islands. We had the privilege of serving in the Solomon Islands for 8 years, as has been introduced. And over those 8 years, we got to see the Salvation Army grow and develop in remarkable ways. When we arrived in the Solomon Islands, the Salvation Army was only 6 years old. It was still an infant. And we came in and picked up the mantle from Majors Malcolm and Laurel Herring, two New Zealand officers who were retired, but came out of retirement to look after the Solomon Islands. And we got to build on the foundation that they laid, and we're very, very grateful for their support and encouragement as we entered into that space. And over the past 8 years, we got to see, got to shape by God's grace and guidance what the Salvation Army looks like. It was a huge responsibility that we held very, very carefully. And it was both an honour and a privilege to do that, but it was also, we had an overwhelming sense of responsibility of what that looked like. And so we constantly sought God's guidance in that space as to what the Salvation Army needed to look like in the Solomon Islands. We're very conscious from the get-go not to import something from Australia and go, this is who we are in Australia, so therefore. In fact, before we left to go to the Solomons, a friend of ours who was the Corps officer at the time in Wonthaggi said, I have a bunch of brass instruments in the band cupboard that haven't been used in 30 years. Do you want to take them with you? And my response in the moment was, I won't need them because we don't want to take something as foreign and we want the Salvation Army to emerge from the soul and soil of the people. Well, 6 months into the appointment, we had local people coming up to us constantly saying, Major, can we please have a brass band? And I'm like, why do you want a brass band? Now, I love brass bands. I've grown up with brass bands and I have thoroughly enjoyed the worship this morning, I've got to say. And I was curious why a group of Solomon Islanders would want brass, and they gave me their explanation, and I thought it sounded reasonable. So I contacted my mate and said, you know, those instruments you offered me 6 months ago, it seems I need them. And we invited over a music teacher, and he brought the instruments with him, as well as some of his own, and we introduced brass music to 21 Solomon Islanders. And that kind of went through ebbs and flows over the last few years. But unfortunately, when he went home, guess who had to continue the journey of teaching brass? Me, a very average cornet player from Glenroy Corps, who's not a bandmaster, never have been. I enjoy playing brass very, very much, but I felt way out of my depth to teach brass music. So I was literally teaching what I knew. And it was good fun. And the Solomon Islanders are very musical people. They don't read music. So that was a journey, teaching how to read music. It was also a journey learning how to play music without music, listening by ear and having the courage to step away from something I'm familiar with and playing what I hear. And so we learned together. And when Captains Brad and Joycelyn were appointed to our roles, I said, Brad, I hope you're ready to take over the band because they're keen. They really want to keep going. We had a new influx of another 17 players just in the last 6 months. So it's amazing how God works. So in the Solomon Islands, we had the opportunity to lead the growth of a number of corps. And we went over there with a strategy that was based on Henry Venn's mission model, which is the 3 self model. Something you may or may not have heard of Henry Venn, but I'm almost certain you have heard of his 3 self model, often represented by what we now know as the Venn diagram. And he was well known for establishing the indigenous churches back in the 1800s, early to late 1800s. And he worked on the idea of a self-governing, self-funding and self-propagating church. And so that was the approach we took, to raise up Indigenous leaders, to build financial sustainability, and to expand mission growth and mission impact. Well, raising up Indigenous leaders was a lot of work because we're dealing with some education barriers, particularly with women who in the Solomon Islands on average only had a grade 3 education, if at all. And also working with local people who have had no background, certainly with the Salvation Army. But God moved and he worked and he raised up local leaders around us. So that was a lot of fun working in that space. Vanessa developed a program called Learning Spaces, where we taught literacy, basic literacy skills to women who had a broken education, known in the Solomon Islands as pencil breaks. And it was a term that was a derogatory term that was used to limit women's participation in the workplace and in society in general outside of the home. We established learning spaces in each one of our churches, not only for women with a broken education, but for children who were not in school or unable to go to school. In the Solomon Islands, every child sits a grade 6 exam, and that grade 6 exam determines who gets into high school and whose education ends there. Because the growth rate in the young population means there are far, far more kids than places available in the school system. And so on average, 2/3 of children in the Solomon Islands miss out on an education beyond grade 6 because there's simply not enough places in high school. So we picked up those kids in the villages and we provided ongoing literacy for those children, and our learning spaces became probably one of our most impacting programs in the Solomon Islands, but also one of our most well-funded programs. When you talk about education of children, it attracts a lot of attention. And so over the past 8 years, we had the privilege of seeing the Salvation Army grow from 2 churches when we arrived to 13 churches when we left. We saw the membership of the Salvation Army increase from 70 soldiers on the roll to 321 soldiers. And I hear now there's another 17 recruits ready to be enrolled in 2 of our village churches. So God was moving at a remarkable rate. I feel as though we were riding a wave of growth and trying to keep up. So the expanding mission part was happening all by itself. Our biggest challenge was sustaining that mission growth. How do we sustain that? And back in 2021, when we're in the middle of COVID, our territorial commander, Colonel Garth Neiman, approached me and said, I need you to write for me a report of the progress of the development of the Salvation Army for IHQ. And so in March, while we were preparing to go on furlough and sitting 2 weeks quarantine in a hotel room in Brisbane, I wrote a 30-page report about the growth and development of the Salvation Army in the Solomons. And that report went to IHQ. And as a direct result of that, we received our first allocation of self-denial funds through what the Army calls the Mission Support Projects. And that was an absolute game changer for us. It enabled us to be able to keep up with the growth that was happening all by itself because God was at work. And it was very, very humbling to be on the receiving end of self-denial funds as officers who have been contributing into that space for many years. The amount of money we received initially for the first year was $65,000 US. Now, $65,000 US in the overall scheme of things is actually not an enormous amount of money. But to us, it was like we won the lottery. It opened up possibilities that we could never have imagined doing by ourselves. If we can go to the next slide. So what I want to walk through with you, just for a few moments, is how those funds were utilised, how your giving to self-denial was used in our context. We've had some extraordinary videos over the past few weeks of different locations around the world, and we're inspired by them every year. And in fact, we took those videos and we used them in the Solomon Islands because we wanted to encourage Solomon Islanders to become contributors into this space as well. Just as they were receiving, we wanted them to give also. So in 2021, we received our first allocation, and we set about on a number of projects. So we put solar freezers into 2 of our villages where we set up a fishing one was a fishing project and the other was a fish filleting plant. So one was in a place called East Ariari on the east coast of Malaita province, and the other was in Munda in the Western province. And those solar freezers enabled them to, the fishing project, catch fish, freeze them and sell them in the local villages. There is no electricity in these places. So to be able to keep up a stock of fish and a supply to provide the village, the freezers were very, very useful. We also bought 2 boats. One went to East Ariari for the fishing project. Incidentally, our church leader at that church, his name was Peter, and he was a fisherman. Very biblical. So it was wonderful to be able to put that resource there. The other boat went to one of our churches up in North Malaita, a place called Kafamori. And in fact, when we went back and visited and followed up these projects, Peter sat down with me and he shared with me how they were using their boat. Not only were they using it to catch fish, they used it to serve their villages around them. And he told me stories about how they used the boat to transport a sick person from the highlands across to a neighbouring village clinic because their clinic was closed. Another time they helped repatriate a dead body from a port that was 2.5 hours away back to their village. Another time they used our boat to rescue 2 fishermen who had capsized in a dugout canoe. So they were using the boat for more than its original purpose to serve their community. And he asked me whether that was okay. And I was like, of course it is. And then he went on and he spoke to me about the fish they were catching and how they were selling the fish and using the money to fund local mission initiatives. And he said, Major, am I allowed to set aside 10% of the fish we catch to feed the widows and the poor people who can't afford to buy them? And I went, absolutely, this is who we are as a Salvation Army. He understood it, he got it, he practiced it. So that was encouraging. We were able to purchase an area vehicle, the Hilux. That vehicle was intended to go over to Malaita province. Unfortunately, we had a few leadership dramas around that time, and where we wanted to allocate that vehicle, things fell over. So we kept it in Honiara because we knew that if we sent it over under those conditions, we wouldn't see it again. So that has been serving the Salvation Army in Honiara and is still intended to head over to Malaita at some point. And the sewing machines, we bought 6 sewing machines along with some material and starter packs, and they went to the home leagues at each one of our churches to help the ladies to be able to sew clothing that they could sell and raise money and generate income for their church. So they were the 2021 projects. 2022, we had 2 bigger projects, same allocation of funds. We set up a container shelter at a place called Burns Creek. Burns Creek is a settlement in Honiara, just on the outskirts. There's about 6,000 people who live in Burns Creek, all settlers or squatters who have taken over a part of Guadalcanal, which was part of the reason for the tensions back in the late 90s. And this shelter was to house one of our learning spaces that we ran there and an outpost. And so it's very simple structure, 2 containers with a roof spanning. It was designed and set up to be transportable because nobody owns land in Burns Creek, and we needed to have the ability to be able to pack it up and move it should we be asked to. So land disputes were very, very common in Solomon Islands, and so we didn't want to spend money on a structure that could be taken over and we would lose that structure. So all of that roofing and the flooring that eventually went in between and spanned those 2 containers was all mobile and could pack up into 1 container so we could transport that out should we require. About 50 to 60 children twice a week meet under that shelter to learn basic literacy skills through the Jolly Phonics program. We're also able to purchase a core bus for Honiara. Honiara Core had a little 12-seater bus that was very, very old and constantly breaking down. It was used about 3 or 4 times on a Sunday to bring people to church. So to get a 26-seater, 28-seater coaster was an absolute blessing. And as the roads deteriorated and travel became more and more difficult around Honiara, reducing 3 trips to 1 was a real blessing. 2023, We had a few smaller projects. One of the challenges in an environment like that is access to resources for the quarters. And one of the beauties of the self-denial appeal, particularly when we give to the evangelical work of the Salvation Army, we have less limitations on how we can use those funds. And at the quarters, we had a washing machine that had rusted out. It was a front loader, and we could no longer open it. We had to use a screwdriver to pry it open, and it was causing all sorts of challenges. We wanted a freezer for the community care ministries, our emergency services, and we had a little shelf in there for ourselves. And our printers kept breaking down because of humidity is brutal on electronics. So to purchase these 3 appliances for the quarters was a real blessing for us at the time. We also purchased another boat for Western Province. We were started to grow beyond Munda, and another church opened at a place called Benossi, and we had an outpost at a place called Pailogi. So Western Province is made up of a lot of little islands that are close together. So having this boat was a game changer in enabling mission travel around the islands. And then we purchased a district vehicle for Vanessa and I. When Garth and Paddy eventually, after COVID restrictions lifted, visited, we took them for a drive around Honiara just to show them our community, where we were serving. And as we're bouncing over these awful roads in a little Hyundai that was wearing out, Garth leant over to Paddy and said, "We need to get these guys another vehicle." Now, I've got to say, our purpose of driving around was not to get another vehicle. There was no hidden agenda, but that's what it resulted in. And through the self-denial mission support funds, we got a brand new Hilux, which was the first brand new vehicle that Solomon Islands received. So that now is being enjoyed by Brad and Joycelyn. 2024 mission projects. The ones on your left, I was able to finish up quite quickly before I left the Solomons after Ness got sick, so we got some more chairs. It's always a good sign when there are not enough chairs in the church. We had 70 chairs for our church at Honiara, and we were averaging about 140 to 150 people a week. We needed more chairs, so we were able to buy a bunch of those yellow chairs for the Honiara core. The little pink chairs up the top were for our learning spaces, both at the shelter in Burns Creek I showed you before, as well as another learning space out the east-west side of town in a place called Mamara. We also got some new curtains for the quarters. Ours were threadbare and old and kept blowing into the fans and tearing apart, and we really wanted to leave something nice for the incoming officers, so it was good to be able to do that. And the lounge suite was falling to pieces because it was an old chipboard thing, just doesn't hold up in the tropics very well. And the little picture in the middle there of some soldiership manuals, the rate of enrolments was increasing as we went along, and printing was extremely expensive, and to be able to print up 100 soldiership manuals meant that we could leave behind resources to facilitate that growth. And the house structure there on the right was to build an officers' quarters at Gateway Core in North Malaita. Now, I'll come back to the officer quarters in a moment and talk about that from a making it happen perspective. But this officers' quarters we were able to fund through the mission support funds from self-denial. Finally, the 2025 allocation. In talking with the projects officers, we met the international projects officer last year and talked about the need for Honiara Core to have their own building. For the past 14 years, Honiara Core has been in rented facilities. This space here is a school hall that we picked up 2 years ago, and the core is growing rapidly. And a part of the way Solomon Islanders think, if a church doesn't have their own building, they're not a permanent mission. They're kind of a foreign, temporary entity. So for the Salvation Army to really get legitimacy in the Solomon Islands, it needed its own facilities. But also, practically, we needed our own facilities, because when we weren't in this space on a Sunday, everything else happened at our place. And so the growth, we needed to keep up with that. So in talking to the International Development Officer, that resulted in an increased allocation that year from $65,000 US to $115,000 US dollars to be set aside as a deposit for property in Honiara. We weren't able to negotiate with anybody, to talk to anybody about building opportunities without anything in the bank. Because the whole process of trying to find funding takes a long time. And to go to somebody who's selling and say, we're interested in this parcel of land or in this property without any money allocated to the project was just wasting people's time and setting us up for disappointment every time we found somewhere we thought would be suitable, but then had to navigate processes of finding funding. So this allocation of 115,000 US, which is the equivalent of 925,000 Solomon dollars, is about 1/4 of what's needed to buy a property in Honiara. Property is very, very expensive in Honiara. I won't go into why that is the case at the moment. So this deposit towards a permanent property means we can go to the negotiating table. And I was very encouraged to read in this month's newsletter from Solomon Islands that they've had some properties come available that could be suitable. And so this really helps towards that. So they're the mission support projects that have been funded by your giving to Self-Denial Appeal. Now, the way it works is that money all goes into a big central account and then gets allocated to different territories around the world. And when we have a project that we want funded, we then submit that through the zone secretary, who will then look for one of the territories that have contributed money in the Red Shield into the mission support funds. Because some territories like to fund vehicles, some territories like to fund education, some territories like to fund health, some territories don't really care what they fund, that money goes wherever it's needed. So some of our projects that you've seen today have been funded by Australia. In fact, many of our projects have been funded by Australia. The vehicles were funded through a US territory who like to fund vehicles. And so we've had funding from different places, and when they see a match between the project we present and the funding that's available, that comes together and we have the result that we have, what you've seen on the screen. I want to divert for a moment away from self-denial to making it happen. And I want to just share a little bit in this space because I want to just honour Matt for a moment and just say thank you for reaching out to us a few years ago. Matt reached out to us in his role in program and let us and said to us that the Salvation Army in Australia was rekindling the Making It Happen campaign, which historically came under the Women's Ministries Department. And he reached out to us because he saw some of the work we were doing and some of the projects that were happening in Solomons. And he asked us if we had any projects that needed funding. And I think my response was like, how many do you want? And so Matt opened the door to the Solomon Islands for the Making It Happen campaign, which was an absolute game changer for us. If we thought the self-denial giving was significant, this really, really was. So we pitched the project to the TC to build an officers' quarters at a place called Moscombe. This was before we had funding for the one you saw on the screen. And we wanted to build our first officer quarters so that we can start to get these appointments officer ready. We were preparing 6 candidates to head to the training college in PNG. But when they return to us, there's nowhere for them to live because we're starting from scratch. And so starting to get our village church's appointment ready was really important to us. And so through the Making It Happen campaign, we set a target of 125,000 Australian dollars to build and furnish our first quarters. The campaign exceeded everybody's expectations under the coordination of Major Rowena Smith, and we raised 209,000 Australian dollars, which was just an extraordinary effort. That equates to about 1.1 million Solomon dollars. So not only were we able to begin building the quarters in Moscombe as we promoted for the campaign, it also meant we could start building a quarters in Honiara to get Honiara appointment ready, as well as Wency and Faustina, who are the Solomon Island couple in the picture alongside Brad and Joycelyn, to get them, they're hoping to go to college next year. And so when they return, there's a quarters. So the building that they're standing in front of is the actual quarters as it stands right now. This is your Making It Happen money at work. And that building is not very far away from being completed now. And these bricks on the right-hand side are at Moscombe. So in the village, there are no Bunnings stores to go and buy materials. Everything is carved out of the bush or brought in by boats. And so these bricks, there's 1,700 bricks that have been moulded on site in the village by carting sand in bags on shoulders up from the beach. And the hill from the beach to this church is very steep, very slippery. I've climbed it many times. They've brought all the sand and up the hill, all the gravel up the hill. The bags of cement have come on a boat called the Gula Tatai, and there they were in their village kitchen moulding bricks ready for this building project. The timber was cut from the bush. Didn't have enough room on the slide for that picture, but they go up into the hills, cut down some big trees, bring in the Lucas mill, and it's a community effort to mill the timber on site to do any kind of construction. It's hard work. And so that's where they're up to right at the moment. Brad and Joyce will be visiting Moscombe at Easter time, and I'm hoping to find some updated photos of some construction happening. So we're very grateful to the Australia Territory for the contribution to the Making It Happen campaign, which will result in 2 officer quarters. And then we got that 3rd officer quarters you saw in previous slides from our self-denial giving. So self-denial matters. It makes a difference. And the opportunity to give you feedback about how your giving is being put to work is a real joy to us. It's a real privilege to be able to share with you that this is actually happening. And these photos are current, what's going on right now. I want to just briefly share with you, as I just speak around our scripture verse, a little bit about our self-denial journey. When Vanessa and I were preparing to go to the training college, we were approached by the corps officers at Glenroy Corps to lead the self-denial campaign that year. Now, up until that point, Ness and I as soldiers had always given to self-denial, but it was nominal at best. We would watch the presentations, which back in those days were overhead projector slides, and we'd listen to the stories being read. And on Awesome Sunday, as we called it back then, we would give $20, $30, whatever it was we had left over. We hadn't really taken seriously, and nor did we see that we were in a position to give 1 week's salary. When we were approached by the corps officers to lead the campaign, we felt really challenged by that. For us to lead that with any integrity, we needed to be taking our giving more seriously. And so for the first time in our lives, we decided that we needed to commit to 1 week's salary on Missionary Sunday. Now, at that moment in time, we were saving up to go to college. We were preparing to go on a holiday, a driving holiday, the following week. We had just replaced the engine in our little Datsun 180B, ready for this holiday. We had spent a lot of money on that, and we had nothing left, literally nothing left. It made no sense for us to give up a week's salary at that moment in time. But we felt God saying to us, you need to do this. We need to lead by example. So we did. We gave, not reluctantly, we gave with a bit of fear and trepidation because we were driving off the following week. And we gave trusting that God would be faithful and God would bless that giving. And we drove up to Mildura in our little Datsun. And one of our day trips, we went across the border, and on our way back, our car broke down at Lake Carrara. And this new engine we put in the car cooked because somebody didn't change the heater hoses when they changed the engine. And so we were left stranded in the middle of nowhere with no money at all, a cooked engine, waiting 5 hours for the RACV to turn up, feeling somewhat dejected and going, God, where are you right now? We've given out of obedience, we've given faithfully, and we're stuck. We got back to Mildura, to the caravan park. We had no transport, we had no money, and that was on the Saturday. On the Sunday, which was 1 week following self-denial altar service, we walked from the caravan park to Mildura Corps, and it was just by coincidence that Mildura had delayed their altar service a week. And so we're listening to the officer of the day get up and speak about how you can't outgive God. And we're sitting there in that congregation listening to this message in all sorts of turmoil. Going, up here we knew this to be true. But what was happening to us right at the moment, we couldn't understand. We felt that God had failed us. We wondered why we had given when we were stuck in these circumstances. Well, after a series of events, a family came after us after we left church and said, we've heard about your situation and we want to help you. This was strangers to us. And they took us into their home. Their cousin was a mechanic. He fixed our car, got us on the road. They blessed us in ways we could never have imagined. And when we returned home, Vanessa was offered a redundancy package from work that covered all of our bills and gave us what we needed to be able to get to training college the next year. And in those moments, we realised you can't outgive God. God is faithful. Our faith isn't being sure of what we see in front of us, but that trusting that God is already there in circumstances we have no control over. This beginning of our self-denial journey taught us some really valuable lessons. It really didn't make any sense for us to give a week's salary then, but I'm so grateful that God challenged us in that space. It set the tone for our officership. It set the tone for our ministry and our giving since. And I can say to you with absolute conviction that God is faithful. When we honour him, even when it doesn't make sense to, he's faithful. And that led us in places we never imagined. We never imagined back then we would be serving overseas. We never imagined after 20 odd years of officership, of giving to self-denial, that we would be receiving from self-denial. What began being motivated by a sense of duty, a sense of obligation, became transformed by the boundless love of God. First, because he is faithful. God is faithful. Then, in response to our faithfulness to his calling upon our lives. As both contributors and recipients of self-denial giving, we have been humbled and overwhelmed by the outpouring of God's love and the love of his people, which has empowered us to live out Paul's exhortation to be on our guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, and do everything in love, especially in a mission context where we've been completely dependent upon the generosity of others. Paul's concluding exhortations to the Corinthian church began with a call to be faithful to the gospel, to be faithful to the calling that God has placed upon us. He said to them, be on guard, be alert, be watchful. In an eschatological context, it could be interpreted that he urged the church to be watchful for the Lord's return. However, in the full context of his letter to the Corinthians, his exhortation was entrenched in the here and now, as he urged the church to be watchful of the enemy who seeks to steal, kill and destroy. Remember, Paul was writing to a church in crisis, a church that was plagued by division and all sorts of conflict that was going on, and he was urging them, be watchful for the enemy. He exhorted them to stand firm in the faith, standing firm in Christ as opposed to backsliding and falling away. The use of the term in the faith instead of the gospel infers that Paul was as much concerned about what is believed and how he was as he was about what is done. Belief drives behaviour. It's an inseparable relationship between faith and deeds that is repeatedly affirmed in Scripture, and most notably in James chapter 2, where James talks about having both faith and deeds that actually demonstrate the faith that we have in God, the way we live our lives reflecting what we believe in here. We would often say to our churches in Solomon Islands, they knew how to worship. Solomon Islanders love to worship. But would say, being the church is more than singing nice songs on Sunday. Being the church is as much about what we do on Monday through to Saturday as well. Faith and deeds in relationship with each other. The last two in this, in verse 13, be courageous and be strong, are related to each other. One would expect such imperatives in the context of outside opposition, But in the context that Paul was writing, he's most likely urging them to remain steadfast in the gospel he preached, especially when you consider the errors of teaching and behavioural issues that he had to address in the previous chapters of his letter. He then goes on to verse 14, and his final exhortation was actually a call to be faithful in their relationships to each other, in how they interacted with each other in the church. He says to them, do all things in love. This exhortation echoes chapter 13. And you'll know chapter 13 well. We've come to call it the love chapter in the church. And Paul talks about we can have all of these gifts, we can have all of these abilities. The Corinthians prided themselves on knowledge, prided themselves on kind of spiritually elaborate gifts. But he says if you don't have love, none of that matters. None of that matters. And here he is at the end of the end of the book, end of his letter, reinforcing this idea that they need to do all things in love. All things included the quarrels in the name of leaders that he spoke into in chapters 1 through to 3. All things included their attitude towards him. This was not a nice feel-good pastoral letter. It was a letter of rebuke in many ways. All things includes the lawsuits he spoke about in chapter 6. All things included husbands and wives' relationships in chapter 7. All things included the abuse of the weak by those with knowledge in chapters 8 through to 10. All things included the abuse of the poor at the Lord's Supper and the failure to edify the church in worship from chapters 12 through to 14. If they were to do all things in love, then none of these other things would have happened. He wouldn't have needed to write the letter that he did if they were doing all things in love. This was an important and powerful exhortation for Corinthians. Everything we do needs to be done in love. According to Paul, the church should be motivated by the love of Christ, which is firmly planted in the gospel and best expressed through our love for each other and the world around us. The self-denial appeal and our theme this year, motivated by love, provides the Salvation Army with a tangible opportunity to put these exhortations in action through our giving that is both faithful to the gospel and faithful to the relationships that have been entrusted to us. Our giving is not motivated by self-gain, but self-denial. Our giving is not motivated by obligation, but compassion. Our giving is motivated by the Spirit of God who calls us to give sacrificially to those around us and those whom he has entrusted to the Salvation Army. It's been an extraordinary privilege to serve in the internationalism of the Salvation Army. Not just in Solomon Islands, we had the privilege of training alongside an Indonesian cadet and to serve him and his wife in Indonesia on a number of occasions, and to see how the Salvation Army is at work around the wider world. We returned to Australia, and as we reorientate ourselves with Australian culture in rural Victoria, we're seeing God at work in that space as well. In all things, we do what we do in love. General Albert Osborne captured this so eloquently when he penned the words, "Except I am moved with compassion, how dwelleth thy spirit in me? In word and in deed, burning love is my need. I know I can find this in thee." So this morning, as we reflect on these thoughts from Paul's words to Corinthians, as we reflect on how our self-denial and giving has made an impact in lands around us, may we be moved with compassion, moved by the love of God, compelled by God's love to be his hands and feet in the world around us. Not all of us get an opportunity to serve overseas, but all of us are a part of an international Salvation Army. All of us are a part of a movement of God that is reaching out into 134 countries and doing some extraordinary things compelled by the love of God. That makes each one of us partners in mission. We are so grateful to the partners here in Australia that have supported us, not just with your giving, but with prayer, words of encouragement, We've received some beautiful messages while we've been away, and every message has been received with gratitude and with love as we've been supported and have felt uplifted in prayer, as people have come alongside us and given us a word of encouragement when we've needed it, and just to know that we have not been forgotten, that we are a part of a movement much bigger than who we are in our own little place. We would take the opportunity to share past self-denial videos with our villagers because we wanted them to see in their isolation that they are a part of something bigger than themselves. We wanted them to be motivated by love, to give out of what God has given them so that they can be partners in ministry and in mission with other Salvationists around the world. And so next week, as we come into the self-denial altar service, there's an opportunity for us to put these exhortations in action. To give courageously. It takes courage to give a week's salary. It really does. To give not because we're being asked to, but we're being compelled by God's love to give out of a spirit of gratitude because of what Christ has given us, and to give in a way that will expand the mission and ministry of the Salvation Army, the kingdom of God in many, many different cultural contexts.